right, welcome everyone. Couple things. Eric had to step out for something, so I'm going to introduce myself. I'll just do it during the presentation. The other thing is, I know this is the end of the day, and I know that Gen AI is going on over there. So for all of you, thank you very much for showing up. I very much appreciate it. I was thinking there was going to be maybe 6 people here, just with those 2 things going on. But anyway, I'm glad you're here. I'm also going to try to channel my inner Eric Johnson and try to keep this fun and lively. I will fail because Eric is really awesome, but I'm going to do my best, okay? This is a topic which I think is going to be a lot of fun for all of us here. Please ask, I'm sure you're going to have questions along the way, so please ask questions in the app, and I hope we have enough time I think we will have enough time at the end for some discussion. So this is accelerating event-driven architectures using domain-driven design. So introduction, who am I? Who is this guy barking at you up here? My name is Brian Zambrano. I am a specialist solutions architect at AWS. Just some quick background on me. I originally came from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm one of those weird people who grew up in the area, the Silicon Valley, and I now live in Fort Collins, Colorado, about an hour north of Denver. I came, probably many of you, I came to IT or computers through a different route. I originally studied engineering at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, which is the central coast of California. And then later on, I went back and did another degree in computer science from San Francisco State. And so I really identify as a developer. So I wrote code for a long time, mostly at startups in the Bay Area. And a few years ago, I thought, I love AWS. I've been an AWS customer for a long time. And I applied, and I got hired in. I started off as a software engineer. So I was doing development, building internal tools at AWS. And then I moved over to this dark side of solutions architecture, which is now really, really fun, and I love it. And I've been a specialist SA for a little over for about a year and a half now, specialist SA. So that's where I come from. That's me. So I like to ask this question when I talk about event-driven architectures. It's just an honest question. I get feedback from the audience, and I won't do it here, so don't worry. But I like to kind of level set. So what is event-driven architecture? We're all here. I think you probably all have an idea in your own heads of what this means. Here's the definition that I like to use, and that is event-driven architecture is an architectural style of building loosely coupled systems that communicate by emitting and responding to events. So that's the one I came up with after some iteration. It's pretty succinct. The thing I'd like to focus in on here is this loose coupling. Okay, and I know this is not new for you. So loose coupling, there's going to be a lot of generalizations in this talk. Okay, so just go with me with the generalizations. Save your questions. We will get there eventually. So loose coupling, we've got a message broker in the middle. We've got these different systems. They're sending messages in and messages are coming out. Cool. So with loose coupling, when one of these systems fails, all these other systems can continue operating. And yes, there's probably going to be some degraded state. Something might not be working quite right. Maybe something's missing on a UI. But overall, what we're doing is avoiding this cascading failure effect. Okay? So this is loose coupling. This is good. We like this in event-driven systems. So distributed systems. When you are building an event-driven architecture, you are building a distributed system. There's this paper called A Note on Distributed Computing. This was from some folks at Sun. Can anyone guess what year this paper came out? 93. Very, very good, close. 94. So this is nearly 30 years old now. And if you read it, there's a lot of stuff that now makes complete sense. But back then, I mean, we were moving from these centralized single address space applications to distributed computing. And so they were talking about the things that we needed to do and consider when we're moving to this distributed systems. So I've got really bad news. Distributed systems are hard. They're really hard. It's an active area of research. So this is, sometimes like we want things to just work, and we're battling just fundamental computer science problems. So this is just the fact of the matter. Distributed systems are hard. So if event-driven architectures are distributed systems, and distributed systems are hard, it stands to reason that event-driven architecture is hard, right? We're going to go down a bit and we're going to come back up, so don't worry, okay? We're going to get to a happy place. On top of that, in event-driven architectures, there are a lot of ideas and concepts that you all have to consider, okay? There's distributed systems parts, but then there's also all these patterns that you might have heard of, you might be thinking about, like CQRS and the Saga pattern. There's different failure scenarios, right? What do you do when you have a degraded system? How do you choose the right event broker? How do you find your domains? Schema validation, Sam Dangler was talking about that. There's a lot of work around there. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here that you all have to worry about and think about and get right before being successful with event-driven systems. So you might, after all this, be like, whoa, maybe I went to the wrong conference. Maybe I'm going to go back and just build a monolith and it'll be way better. So you probably look like this cat, just completely freaked out. I have some good news for you. Okay, here's now we're going to come up. We hit the trough. Now we're going to come back up. There's a lot of things that there's a lot of ways to work around these complexities. Okay, we've been doing this for a long time now, and we have ways of working around the complexities. Like we can use different technologies. There are well-known patterns, and you can work around a lot of these complicated topics and ideas, except for one. There's one on this list that you can't work around just magically or look it up in a book or in a blog. Can anyone guess what that one thing is? All right, the title of the talk gave it away, right? Finding your domain boundaries. So there is no single way to just go and magically, again, read someone's blog and then get this right. It's not that easy. The other ones might not be easy, but you can do this. So this one takes a little bit more work, and that's going to be the topic of what I'm going to talk about right now, is how do you find these domain boundaries? And then really more importantly, why are these even important? So definition, a problem domain is the area that you are all working in within your organization, right? So let's just take Amazon.com an example. I mean, it's a huge domain, but e-commerce, that makes sense. Maybe I'm selling dog food, okay? So like, the thing that you are, the business problem that you are trying to solve is your problem domain. And presumably you are doing this so that you can make your customers happy, make money, or just like maybe you're a nonprofit, you just want to exist as a business entity, okay? But that is your problem domain. So you are all working in a problem domain. I'm guessing they're probably different, but this is the main concept here. You are working within a problem domain. So if we draw this out, we've got a box, that's your problem domain, and within there, you are going to have subdomains. So these are areas of business functionality or things that you can break up, how you can break up a big problem domain. So if you map that to, again, this is an overly simplistic diagram. If you were to map these problem domains to systems, what would it look like with an event-driven architecture? So again, overly simplistic, but in an EDA, you would have these different areas of responsibility, and there's bounded context and subdomains, which we can, there's subtleties in there. But the long and the short of it is these different systems that now serve one particular purpose are going to communicate with a message broker. Okay, so now you can break these up in these different systems into teams, different topologies, et cetera. But very coarsely, this is how you can map subdomains and bounded context to an event-driven architecture. So the question is, how do you find these? How do you find these subdomains or these boundaries within your specific problem domain? How do you do that? Who here has seen this book? Or who here owns this book? A few. Who knows it? Who has heard about domain-driven design before? A few. Who could explain it? Kind of one person. Okay, don't feel bad. The funny thing, I have a funny anecdote about this book. I bought this book probably 15 years ago. This is from 2003. So I probably bought it in 2008, something like that. I actually gave this book away about a year ago. I put it on Craigslist. I was like, I'm never going to read this thing. So I would say probably most people who own this don't understand it. They've probably started it 5 different times and never finished it. It is not a page turner, I can tell you that. It is a dry read. It's very dense and complicated. Personally, I feel like I've just been on this journey of trying to find something that can help me help my customers break down a big problem. And over probably the last year or so, maybe like even 9 months, I feel like I've had some breakthroughs with domain-driven design finally. So if you're one of those people who have been interested in this and it's never really sunk in, do not feel bad. You are in good company. I think pretty much everyone goes through that. So for the people who don't know, what is domain-driven design? This is a quote from the author, Eric Evans. And so the quote is, domain-driven design is both a way of thinking and a set of priorities aimed at accelerating software projects that have to deal with complicated domains. So that's pretty good. It's a little bit ambiguous, and we're going to go deeper into really figuring out what this is and how to use it effectively. Just like EDA, domain-driven design, like I mentioned earlier, is complicated. So if you just go out and type it into your favorite search engine, you're going to get a lot of stuff. So I just typed it in randomly, found a bunch of different things, slapped them on here. It's confusing. It's complicated. We get that. I think this is one of the key points here, is that domain-driven design focuses on understanding your domains, your subdomains, your problem domains, not necessarily how to implement those. You can get to that level. And I think that's where a lot of us developers go wrong, is we look at this big book and we read it and we try to immediately start applying it to code. That's where I think this thing goes completely off the rails. So if we think about this and level set, this is about understanding. It's not necessarily about building and applying and turning that into code artifacts. So that's really, really key. So if you've been confused or you're not even familiar with domain-driven design, don't worry. Just think about, this is a tool to help me and my teams understand what we're doing. So that theme is going to carry through here. So it helps you and your teams find this shared language that you can use when you're talking when engineers are talking to business, or when businesses are talking to engineers. And really, I would extend that to anyone in the company. Like, once you have this shared language, you can speak the same language, and those miscommunications, the idea is those are drastically reduced or go away in an ideal world. I think this is a great quote that I like to use often. So this is from Alberto Brandolini, who created something called event storming, which I'm going to go into shortly. And the quote is, "It's developers' misunderstanding, not domain experts' knowledge, that gets released into production." So, think about how many times you've seen or heard the product people are saying, "Why is this working this way?" It's not because the engineers are stupid. It's because they didn't understand what they needed to implement. We implement what we understand the problem to be, or the solution to the problem. And so this happens all the time when companies, organizations are not building the right thing. I would argue a lot of it comes back to miscommunication between product, the company, and the engineers who are building it. So this is really key. I see this all the time, and I feel like I'm like this very often, where if I'm talking to customers, the engineers are dogs on a leash, and they are just ready to be let loose. Like, they want to go and write code, and if you let them off the leash, they will go. They say, "What can I do? Give me some technology. I want to go do this. I'm so excited to do this." And if you do that, oftentimes you end up with this, where they can go and attack a problem, and they think they're doing a great job because they're slinging code around, they're integrating all these different AWS services, and it's awesome and it's fun. But then at the end of all this, it's like, did you build the right things? Or, hey, like, we ended up somewhere, and now I've got this other problem because I didn't think through where these boundaries exist within my application or within my problem domain. So to prevent this, we need some way to get people thinking the right way. So how do we bring order to an otherwise complex, or I call it non-trivial system or domain? How do you do that? So if you go back to that misunderstanding quote, if developers misunderstand the domain and make a mess, turn your developers into domain experts. That's really the key thing here, is coming to that shared understanding and making your engineers understand and really be the experts of the domain. And I'd say even turn your teams, turn as many people as you can within your organization into domain experts. And so event storming is a tool that I found a while ago, which I think I haven't found anything that is better than this. So event storming is a process it's a workshop-based approach to find your domains, to figure out your boundaries, to explore and learn together. So I'm gonna walk through how this works now in more detail. So like I said, it's a workshop-based approach to break down a non-trivial domain into its constituent parts. The main goal of this, again, is to come to a shared understanding. The main output is not to go and have a code artifact that you can deploy to production. That is not it. The main idea of this and the main goal is to come to a shared understanding. So this is a diagram that the person that I was trained by came up with, and I like this a lot. So there are different versions or different flavors of event storming. The first one is this thing at the top called a big picture event storming. And what this is if on the left, on the y-axis, this is really like the level of detail. So this is like the really high 30,000-foot overview. Like big picture, the name hopefully makes sense. But what you're doing is maybe you're a startup, or maybe you're taking a monolithic application and you want to modernize it, or you're doing some big project and you need to figure out, what does this thing do? Like, do we even understand this end to end? Again, whether it's an existing process or something completely new. Like, do we know how this works or how it should work? So the big picture event storming session is pretty high level. Down on the left, if you're looking at it, this is more around looking at current state. So what is the current state of this thing? Also in terms of people, like who's gonna participate in this, the big thing here, again, is for a shared understanding, you've got to share. So you have to have a cross-section of your organization there. In a big picture event storming, it's going to lean a little bit more towards the business folks, to the people who are domain experts already, or who have an idea of what this thing should be. And of course, like, we want to have engineers, but we also want to have product people. We might have leaders within the organization. So anyone with a vested interest in this thing that you're building should be here. And I say that because it's a spectrum, so it should not be a room full of 12 engineers. That's not going to go well generally, especially for a big picture one. Once you zoom in a little bit more, you can get to a little bit more detail. So that is a process level event storming session. So this now spans like current state and the future state. So you might get into solutioning a little bit in terms of, hey, we've got an opportunity here to improve this. This thing's slow, and you get into, again, a little more detail on the engineering side. So this now, like, I think the spectrum widens on who you're bringing in, and also what you're doing. Now you're talking about both the current state and the future states. And then in here, you're probably also going to be talking across teams. If you've got something fairly complex, it's not going to be just one team. It's going to be multiple teams. And talking about this together. Again, a little bit more detail. And the last one is this design level event storming session. So now this one, we're shifting more towards the future. So this is what we want to do, and really also a little bit closer to how we're going to do it. So whereas the big picture one favors the business leaders and business owners, product owners a little bit, this design one is going to focus a little bit more on the engineering side. So you'll still have product owners, but you're going to have more engineers here and talk about a little bit more, talk closer to the implementation details. So for this talk, what I wanted to do was talk through what a big picture event storming session would look like. There's a lot of detail in this, so we don't have a lot of time. So I did want to focus on this one and just talk about, if you were to want to do this yourself, or have someone at AWS come and help you with this, what would that look like? What does the process look like? What are the steps involved? So I'm going to focus on big picture. So first off, of course, there's this, we have to define what an event is. So an event is something that a domain expert cares about. okay? And we know that events are immutable facts that have occurred in the past. So once an event has happened, it's done. Like, you can't take that back. It's already been triggered. So step one. Step one is inviting the right people. And I alluded to this at the beginning just a little bit, but you have to have the right people in the audience, in the room. So, for a physical, there's different versions of this in terms of doing this physically on paper with stickies or doing it virtually, but no matter what you do, you have to have the right people in the room. So for a big picture event storming session, like I said, product owners, business folks, if you can get some leaders or people who really care about this thing or have some idea of what it should be doing, you're probably going to want some people who've implemented it. If you're working especially on an existing solution, so people who have an idea of how it works today. So bring those people into the room. Again, the sharing of knowledge is the key part with all of this. So you have to have the right audience in order for this to work. So I've kind of enumerated this, step one, step two. It's not really this linear. I mean, there's a lot of, this goes all over the place, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm trying to sequence it a little bit. So once you have your audience, the next thing is, running your session. And what you do is start with crowdsourcing all of the events that you can think about that make up a particular business process. And so how this looks is everyone writes events individually, and don't worry about the details at all. Like, this is a brainstorming session, and it's a way to come to, again, that shared understanding. And so, there's really no wrong answer here. This is an exploratory part of the process, is everyone's just dumping out as many events as they can think of in order to make this business process work. So what it looks like is this. So people are writing sticky notes. We have orange sticky notes. If this is in person, these are literally, the little, Post-it notes. Orange is representative of events usually. It doesn't matter what color as long as you're using the same color. And so here, what this is showing is, if you look at the names of the events, this actually ties back to Serverless Espresso. And so we did this internally. There's spelling mistakes in here. And so I literally copied a subset of what we did and put it into here. And so as people are creating these events, just carve out a part of the either physical board, physical paper, or virtual board, carve out a space and start putting them in different locations. Once everyone does that, your next exercise as a group is to sequence these things. And this is very rough, right? Again, you're not going to get this right the first time at all. This is exploration. And so if you think about, time is on the x-axis, participants will take all their sticky notes, again, either virtual or physical, and put them in a rough sequence of how this business process, this thing flows from left to right. So if you'll notice here, there's a lot of duplicates. Like, there are many every single one of, every single event in here has a duplicate. And duplication's good. Duplication's very good because it means that people are thinking about something, and it's something that's probably pretty important. So it's top of mind for a lot of people. And inevitably, you're going to have a whole bunch of crazy things out there. So this is a very simplistic overview, but duplication is something that you would expect, that you would hope for, and you would want to drill into. And as this workshop continues, these things start gaining more and more importance. So as you're going through this, more events are showing up. We use something called hotspots to really represent anything that is a question. So if you go and read, the event storming, any handbooks or whatever, hotspots is a term that is used. Again, these can be questions, they can be problems, they can be anything that you're uncertain of. So, in this case, because hey, this step, it's happening, it's important, but we're asking the barista to go and push this button. Does that slow the barista down? Or someone might say, this is a really bad area of our application today. We know this is a problem. Or we had a question when we were doing this a while ago. When is the receipt actually printed? We don't know. Is it before this event or after this event? So that's fine. Grab a pink sticky, put it on the board. It's we have to answer this. I did this with an enterprise customer last week, And it was a complex domain. So as we were doing this and exploring, over and over again, they would come up with something that's like, oh, what about this other thing that we were integrating with? And so they would grab a pink sticky, put it over, and at the end of this whole session, they said, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know in here. And that's part of this process. That's part of the exploration. So that is a good outcome from this, because unless you can go and answer those things, any implementation you have is probably not going to be quite right. And you'd have to figure that out as you were building, which arguably is a little bit less efficient way of doing this or building. Okay, so the next step is you have some events. You have a general sequence of your events, of your business process. You have some questions and hotspots. So the next thing in here would be to add in people. You might hear or see this referred to as actors. I do like the term people because this it's just more tangible. It's like it just makes more sense to people. So it's not personas. It is literally like what person is doing this thing, or here it's I think about it is what person is served by this event. So here at the beginning, when the barista is receiving an order, it's really the barista who is the recipient of that event. That's the person who is served by that event. Over on the right, we have now the customer. We've moved over to this customer area where once an order has been shedded out, even though the barista is performing the action, it's the customer who is the recipient of that action. So you can add people along this timeline too to figure out what's happening in this process. Like who are the individuals or groups of people who are benefiting or interacting with these events. Okay, so now we get to an important part, which are called pivotal events. Pivotal events, key events. I mentioned earlier that this duplication is good. Duplication of events is good because multiple people have thought about this. It's an important thing. So when you see a lot of stickies or a lot of virtual cards that are lining up and are all kind of the same thing, they don't have to be written the same way, but they're going to represent the same idea, and there's going to be discussion around this. So when you see that, that's a clue that there's something going on here. This is the emergent structure of boundaries, right? This is not necessarily like a bounded context or a subdomain between these two blue markers, but I think it's the emergence of something. It's a clue. So when you start seeing these pivotal events, I think a few things happen. One, it starts to add a little bit of order to the board, and people can start seeing like, oh, there's some shape taking place here. And then the other thing is just that, like it just visually helps you organize. But then also, again, you start seeing clues into how you might be able to break this thing apart. Next is identifying external systems. So you are all presumably building software. There are things that you're going to own, systems, and there are things that you are not going to own. So for example, in Serverless Espresso, there is a printer. The printer is attached to the network. We don't really control that, right? So that's an external system that we need to interface with that we have almost no control over. I mean, you can argue a little bit there, but the network might go out, something might happen. So any system that you interface with that you don't own or that you can, in the literature, in the books, one of the way it's described is any system that where you can blame someone else, that's the system, okay? So you can add systems throughout here to figure out, again, what you're interfacing with. Okay, when you zoom out, I was giving you a very simple, kind of linear flow, but what happens when there are things that are happening in parallel or asynchronously, right? So you might have a single process, like inevitably, like most domains are not really linear. One thing I do and I've done myself is event storming a movie. And that's really nice because it gets you warmed up and it's pretty easy to understand, but a movie is inherently linear, right? You start at the beginning and you go to the end, but software in the real world isn't that simple. So what happens when there are systems or processes that happen at the same time in parallel? For that, you can use these things called swim lanes. And there are different ways to break this up, but swim lanes I think is a really nice one. Again, visually, if you look at this, you don't even have to know what these are. There's no detail on these cards. But you can see that there's a main process up top that has some pivotal events. So there's some things going on there with some, again, the indication of boundaries. Down below, we have another area that is independent. So we're working within the same domain, but we have these two different processes going on that probably are going to be working together, but may not line up kind of end to end in a linear process. Okay, so as you start going through this, things are going to start taking shape slowly. So this is an emergent structure. The structure does not just appear out of, right away. It emerges eventually, slowly, like as you are moving cards around, having discussions, talking about this. And so here, the first front part of this might be coffee ordering. And now the middle is coffee fulfillment. Now the barista's making the coffee. And at the end, finally, it's delivery. But down below, what might be happening in parallel with that? Well, maybe we have something where we're keeping track of the number of cups and the number of lids, the number of coffee beans, and we have someone going and fetching more stuff as the orders are coming in. Well, that's really important, but we can do that in parallel with the main coffee ordering. So we're now, with this example, we're in the same domain of this serverless espresso thing, but we have different processes happening in parallel, and now we can start seeing like there's some subdomains in here, right? Cashier ops versus coffee ordering. Okay, so once you get to this place where you have these, a general flow, one trick or one tool in here is to have someone walk through the entire story. So literally get up to the board and start at the very beginning. So a person will show up and say, okay, I'm going to read these cards and say, a user scans the QR code on their phone. Then they go to the next step. The customer then browses the menu and places an order, and they're literally walking through this and reading each thing. And there might be discussion along the way. Get a red sticky or a pink sticky for questions. If any come up, there might be some reordering or some sequencing. The barista receives the order, the barista prepares a drink, and then finally, the barista calls out the customer's name and they pick it up. So you're tying what you've just discovered to a business process, and having someone talk through it in just plain words is really interesting and fascinating because it has to make sense, right? You're discovering this together. Another trick here that you can use is doing this backwards. So going the other way. So start at the end. Like if you're doing a movie, they lived happily ever after. Before that happened, this happened. And what that forces sometimes is asking a question, wait, does this event really happen after this thing? Like that doesn't really make sense to me. And so you can go both ways here, go forward to backwards and backwards to forward to, again, force those conversations and see if this makes sense. You're discovering together, you're learning this all together. Okay, as you go, what's gonna happen is that there will be areas of the board that still don't feel quite right? Like over here, this area on the right might not be quite what you might not be quite happy with that. It might need a little bit more refinement. That's okay. Other areas are feeling good. Like we've done that, okay, we're very confident about that. This is an iterative process, right? Like those areas that need refinement, you will go back and talk about them and refine them. That's okay. Again, it's iterative. You're learning about this. Eventually, what you'll see is that this whole thing is going to start to make sense. The customer I worked with last week, I wasn't quite sure. I thought we still needed a little bit more refinement, but I had them walk through the whole thing, and this was an all-day workshop that we did, and everyone was engaged. And so they read through the entire thing, and they're like, yeah, they said, this is good. Like, we're happy with this. They had a bunch of questions. They did not know answers to those questions, but overall, the entire flow just made sense to them. Like, there was tons of detail buried in there, but we were at the point where, again, we were doing this big picture session. And so the end-to-end flow, they were feeling really positive about. And so this flow and this whole front to back, again, it's an emergent structure that will start to show as you're working through this process. Okay, another thing that you can do in here is something called adding business value. So what you can do is have a different sticky where give people a couple of votes and say like, where is an area where we can either raise our value or lower our value in here? And value is arbitrary. It can be time saved, it can be dollars, it can be your reputation. So no matter what your value is, where does that actually go up or go down? And so as people start adding this, you might see like, hey, this one area, we've got a bunch of people calling this out with hotspots, like this is bad, this is slow, and people are saying our value is going down here, whatever that is, right? Again, whether it's time or developer, it doesn't really matter. This would be an area to focus in on, right? This is an area for improvement because your value is going down and people are calling it out as, obviously with the hotspots, they've already called it out as something to improve. And then on the flip side, when your value is going up, if the value is going up for a certain area, maybe that's an area where you're understaffed and you don't have enough engineering resources to go and focus in on. That would be another, again, area to focus in on because that's how you're either making money or doing something to improve the system. Okay, I'm gonna declare that I think getting your boundaries right is the biggest design decision that you will make when you're building software. You have to get these right. All the technology in the world is not gonna help you unless you can get these correct. And this is tricky. It's definitely tricky. This is the definition of what a bounded context is from Alberto. So ideally, a bounded context should contain a model tailored around a specific purpose. The perfectly shaped tool for one specific job, no trade-offs. So sort of like the Unix philosophy, do one thing and do it well. So, if you've heard of bounded context, it's kind of squishy to kind of define what that is, but this is his definition, which I like a lot. So it's something that does one thing and it does it very well. So how do you find, we've done this awesome event storming session, we've got these stickies all over, we've got some swim lanes and boundaries. How do you identify the bounded context within here? And you might think, oh, that's easy because it's just, we have the swim lanes in the pivotal event, so it's just the things in between there. And that's not quite right. So these are indications, but it's not a one-to-one mapping. It's not quite that simple. And so, unfortunately, you have to do a little bit more work here. So there are ways to identify based on what you have. There are ways and tricks to identify where your bounded contexts are. And these are just some of them. So, I say these are probably the main ones. So obviously look at the pivotal events. I think those are very good clues about where your context may lie. You can also look at the people on the board. So when there's a handoff, in our example, from the barista to the customer, that's another clue that there's something going on there, that there's a boundary because the people are changing, in this. So there's some exchange going on. And you can also look at, as you're doing this with your team, what is the language that people are using? Are people saying the same things within a particular area? Probably, if there's a grouping of the same language, again, that's another very good clue that you've got a boundary there. And then, if you're working with your team, you can look at the interaction. There might be a group of people who are off in one area talking about something. So that's just a physical clue that there's something going on in a particular part of the board. So in reality, your boundaries might look more like this, where you've got these, again, these are all within within the pivotal events and the swim lanes. So it's not a one-to-one mapping, but it might look something similar to this, okay? And this is a simple drawing, so it's probably not this obvious in the real world, but this gives you an idea that it is, it's a little bit more complex than just the pivotal events. So if you look at those, how would you break this up? So the first, again, this is made up, but those first three bounded contexts might be one particular subdomain. So you might be, those three bounded contexts might be solving a similar problem, but there are boundaries between those. So you might give that to team one. And then team 3 might have their own, and you can see how this expands out. So again, this depends on your own organizational structure, but you can see how now you can start taking these bounded contexts and start distributing the work out. And now there's purpose and there's structure between how you organize yourselves and your software. So with event-driven systems, how would you tie these together? Well, you already have the events. You've done the events. And of course, you're going to refine those. But you have a very good starting point. And you have your boundaries. So now you have your close to getting your microservices down, your systems down. And so now it should be fairly easy. And I'm not going to say it is easy, but it should be easier to figure out how to map this to an event-driven architecture. And people always ask, well, how many services do I need? Is it a one-to-one mapping? I don't know. I mean, I don't really worry about that too much. But for this, for this bounded context, maybe there's 2 services in there. Maybe that one down on the bottom right, maybe it's just a single Lambda function. I really don't know. But the big thing here is figuring out, again, where those boundaries exist. How you implement those is going to be up to you. Again, this is a slippery slope because you can get into all sorts of stuff to figure out what this should be and how big they should be. And I don't really know the answer, honestly. I think it's going to be up to you. But again, just the one thing I want to drive home here is that it's not a one-to-one mapping. Okay? One bounded context could be one microservice or it could be n, and I don't know what n is. It's probably not 1,000, but it's probably very often more than one. So if you start seeing this showing up, like, hey, I'm going to build event-driven architecture with this, and you start seeing these gigantic leaps between systems from front to back, I would say that's a smell. So that's probably a sign that something's not quite right. So are there going to be leaps kind of in different parts? And sure, I can imagine that. But if you see something like this, the start of the movie and going to happily ever after does not make sense, right? And it's the same thing with your software. There are going to be, again, like I said, leaps and maybe some loops. But if you see these gigantic movements across the timeline, a sign that something's probably not quite right. Okay, at the end here, I want to go over finding the right scope. So when you're using language, like earlier I was saying, coffee fulfillment, coffee ordering. So I see this a lot also. And I struggle with this myself. So what is the right scope of a subdomain or even just of an idea? It's like order delivery. Who thinks that's a good one? It's a trick question, right? So order delivery. Well, what are you ordering or what are you delivering? So here's a picture from my house just a little while ago. You can see the pumpkins. That's just recent, right? It's Halloween. So here's an Amazon delivery. So this is a delivery, order delivery. So's that. I just ordered some F-35s, right? That's the Joint Strike Fighter. Who's the customer of this? Well, you've got this fool on the left versus the Department of Defense. So delivery and customers, those are very different things. And so this is where, again, think about the domain that you're operating in. Who is your customer? Even the F-35, there are 3 different versions of it. And who do you want to, well, there's the Department of Defense, but there's also all these countries, and I couldn't even fit all the flags on here. So ordering something and delivering something are not specific enough at all. And so this happens a lot, and I think it takes time. When you're doing this, you are probably going to need to break down your naming conventions, your domains, a lot further than you think. Even with my silly example of serverless espresso, so coffee ordered, that's a terrible one. Is it an online order? Is it in person? Was it from the mobile app? Was it from somebody else who's picking it up for their manager? I don't know. So you need to get a lot more specific generally when you're coming up with your domains and bounded context. So that's another really key point here. Iterate on this. If you get it wrong, you'll probably know, but you'll have to come back. I mean, getting these things right is really key. So as you keep going and going, event storming does have many more things. I'll just call them things available. So you'll see this. There's this picture in the upper left. There are things called read models, and we've got aggregates, and there are other things. Start small. That's my advice to you. if you go out and read all the event storming literature or the books, you'll read this, it's like, okay, I'm not getting it quite right. I did that. So my advice is start with just the basics, like I said at the beginning. Start with events. You can go a long way with just events. Just events and pivotal events. That right there will get things moving along pretty quickly. So don't overcomplicate it. The picture down the right it's pulled that off of PowerPoint. So apparently that is a real world session. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but if you look closely, you can see some white lines. And so they're starting to carve out their boundaries, okay? This will happen, like you will be able to do this. Again, don't overthink this and don't overcomplicate it. I assert that even a very poorly run event storming session is better than nothing at all. Like you can go a long way even if you're a novice. So practice and try it. Feel free to scan these. These are two books. The first one, they're both on LeanPub. They both say that they're not complete, but they're still worth buying. But the first one's from, again, the creator, Alberto Brandolini. And the second one is by another trainer called Paul Rayner. He is very good. I was fortunate enough to get training from him just a little while ago. And he has an event storming handbook, which is a little bit more practical advice, a little bit less on the theory and more on how to facilitate your own event storming session. So again, both of these on LeanPub, both very worthwhile. And that is the end. So thank you very much.